Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If you're listening late at night, let me know what time it is and where you're tuning in from. Just drop it in the comments below. And if you'd like more calm stories like this, consider subscribing. It helps us keep the past alive, one quiet hour at a time. Now, let's begin. Asterisk, you wake to the sound of water that isn't there. The year's 2180 BCE, the once mighty Nile, lifeblood of the Egyptian cosmos, has failed. For the third year in a row, its annual inundation has come in weak, tepid waves. The black silt that once blanketed the banks, rich and thick and teeming with seed hope, is dry. The fields lie fallow. The sky above is a flat, white haze. No clouds, no wind, just stillness. It wasn't always like this. For centuries, the kings of the Old Kingdom had ruled as gods on earth. They built pyramids, not as monuments, but as living equations of divine order. The sun rose and set by pharaonic will. The grain grew by decree, and a river eternal. Predictable was their signature across the land, until it wasn't. The story doesn't begin with collapse. It begins with subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. A few days' delay in the flooding, a smaller catch of fish in the delta, a letter from an official in Elephantine reporting a lesser swell of the southern cataracts. These whispers never reached the throne room in Memphis. Not at first. The Pharaoh Pepe II had reigned longer than any man in memory, over 90 years, by some accounts. By the time the Nile began to change, he was a weary old man, propped up by courtiers and papyrus scrolls. His reign had become ceremonial. Real power lived in the hands of regional governors, each of whom had grown bolder, richer, and more autonomous with time. In the third year of low floods, the problems became undeniable. Grain reserves, once stacked like miniature pyramids in state granaries, began to dwindle. Prices soared. In Thebes, a sack of barley that once cost a single deepin of copper now cost 7. People began to whisper of divine punishment, of the gods abandoning their king. Starving farmers left their fields and sought refuge in temple complexes, only to find those temples just as desperate. And still, no action came from the capital. Pepi II's court was paralyzed by ritual. Sacrifices to Hapi, god of the Nile, increased. Incantations were offered, but nothing practical. No redistribution, no change in infrastructure, no effort to repair the irrigation channels that had begun to crack and crumble. The pharaoh, once the divine master of the two lands, had become a ghost in his own palace. Out in the nomes, the provinces, things began to shift in dangerous ways. Nomarchs, who once reported yearly to the throne, began to ignore summons. They built their own fortresses, minted their own tokens, issued commands as if they were minor kings. In Asayat, the tombs of these local lords grew as grand and geometrically perfect as royal pyramids. Power was fragmenting, but it wasn't just drought. It was the brittle nature of a system built on the assumption of eternal cycles. In a world where divine order depends on the Nile's regular rhythms, the failure of one flood becomes more than a natural disaster. It becomes a cosmological crisis. And into that void, chaos stepped quietly. Banditry increased. Caravan roads became unsafe. Tombs were looted by the very people who had once built them. In Herakla Palace, two rival families, both descended from high priests, claimed kingship of Upper Egypt. Meanwhile, in Abydos, local militias took control of temple food stores, distributing grain not by decree, but by force. And still, no word. From Memphis, what happened inside the royal court during these years is unclear. Few records survive. Some speculate that palace intrigue, succession disputes, internal sabotage further weakened the already feeble regime. Others believe that regional governors simply stopped listening altogether, that the pharaoh lived out his final years in ceremonial isolation, while the country beneath him dissolved into dust. It's worth pausing to reflect. How fragile is divine rule when the river it's built on dries up? The fall of the Old Kingdom wasn't dramatic. There was no single battle, no torchlit siege. It didn't end with a dagger in the dark. It ended in silence, in hungry mouths, in broken canals, in nomarchs who stopped believing in pyramids and started building walls. And yet, its people still dreamed of order. Even as grain disappeared and temples fell silent, scribes continued to copy old hymns. Farmers, even starving ones, still left offerings at roadside shrines. Somewhere, in a dry field near the collapsed irrigation trench, a child placed a reed doll into a cracked jar and whispered a prayer for rain. Was this hope, or was it memory? The line between divine faith and collective habit had blurred. Egypt didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled slowly, thread by golden thread, by the time Pepi II died. No one really noticed. The throne passed, but not to a king with real power. The first intermediate period had begun, and with it came centuries of forgotten names, feuding provinces, and ghost towns that once hosted gods. But this raises a deeper question. Did Egypt fall because the Nile failed Dor? Because the pharaohs forgot how to rule without it? Asterisk, when the water recedes and the fields crack open, power does not vanish. It relocates. The old kingdom, built on pyramids and priestly ritual, began to dissolve, not because of a sudden rebellion or foreign conquest, but because power seeped out of Memphis like water leaking through neglected irrigation ditches, while the throne still held its rituals, and the viziers still read from scrolls of divine order. The true heartbeat of Egypt shifted southward to the Nomes. Egypt had always been a land divided into nomes, each ruled by a nomarch in stable times. These local governors served as arms of the central government. They taxed the fields, managed the canals, and enforced the pharaoh's divine will. But in the lean years, as famine set in and the Nile forgot its rhythm, these men stopped being stewards and became kings in everything but name. What began as regional survival quickly became subtle rebellion. In the nome of Thinis, a governor named Jati began issuing decrees independent of Memphis. His scribes recorded victories and skirmishes against bandits. But between the lines, they also recorded the quiet building of autonomy, the establishment of local granaries, fortification of borders, and the minting of seals bearing Jati's name larger than the pharaohs. And he was not alone. Across Upper Egypt, nomarchs began expanding their tombs. They had themselves depicted in poses once reserved only for kings seated on thrones, holding flails, making offerings to gods. The absence of a central authority that could provide food or order, the people turned to whoever could, and, in return for protection and grain, they offered their loyalty that no longer pointed toward Memphis at the Nile. Once a single artery of divine order had become 1,000 broken capillaries. Trade slowed, temple offerings dwindled. Communication between regions became patchy, delayed by mistrust and travel hazards. Even the temples, the eternal symbols of state and divine connection, were now dependent on regional lords for upkeep. In Thebes, the local governor in Tef seized upon the moment. He declared himself overseer of Upper Egypt and initiated a slow but deliberate campaign of unification, not for Egypt, but for the south. He constructed temples, supported priesthoods, and positioned himself not as a usurper, but as a restorer. To many, he was not a rebel. He was salvation. Meanwhile, in the north, another power rose in Heracleopolis. There, a family of priest-earner leaders claimed descent from the sun god Ra and appointed themselves the natural heirs to the broken old kingdom. Their rule, too, was born from the hunger of the people. They distributed grain with great ceremony, stamped documents with newly crafted royal seals, and maintained the illusion of order. Egypt, for the first time in centuries, was split. 2 thrones, 2 courts, 2 visions of Egypt, and between them, the shrinking common folk caught between famine, taxation, and the erosion of the familiar. But still temples continued their rites in Abydos. Priests still recited mourning hymns, even as their offering tables sat nearly bare. In Saqqara, embalmers continued to wrap the dead with care, though their linen came stained and coarse. And in Memphis, the last court scribes of the Old Kingdom continued to write long after no one was reading. One such document, preserved in the dry air of the tomb of Meruka, contains a chilling line. The poor man's heart is a dust bowl, and he prays not for grain, but for silence. It was silence that ruled the land now. Not peace, not law, silence, and beneath that silence, movement, as more nomes became self-sufficient, and more nomarchs fortified their rule. Order skirmishes increased. Trade routes were guarded by spearmen rather than royal patrols. The tombs of minor officials now held hidden compartments, not for treasures, but for weapons. Egypt had not been conquered from without. It was fragmenting from within, and in this fragmentation, even the stars began to feel further away. Ancient Egyptians had always looked to the sky to understand the world. Sirius rising at dawn meant the Nile would flood. The arc of the moon guided planting cycles. The stars above weren't just lights, they were promises. But now, even those patterns seemed uncertain. With famine and political division came omens, some real, some invented. Comets were feared, eclipses were interpreted as cosmic judgment. The people did not curse the pharaoh. They simply stopped believing he had any say in the heavens. In this era of disconnection, single metaphor began to spread among scribes and villagers alike. The 2 lands are like reeds pulled apart by oxen. That was Egypt now. Still green in places, still living, but stretched and framed. Yet, through all of this, no one declared the Old Kingdom dead. No monument was toppled. No ritual was outlawed. The idea of the pharaoh lingered like perfume in an empty hall, and perhaps that was the tragedy. The system had no mechanism to adapt. It had been built on the premise of permanence, paternal cycles, and divine kingship. It could not bend. So it cracked as nomarchs built walls and priests whispered prayers to increasingly distant gods. A slow war for Egypt began, not one of trumpets and chariots, but of grain, scribes, and forgotten tombs. And here lies the deeper silence. What is a pharaoh without a people who believe in him? And what becomes of a people who no longer believe in anything at all? Asterisk, you walk through a village where no one knows the king's name. That, perhaps more than drought or famine, marks the true end of a dynasty, not the fall of Memphis, not the rise of new rulers, but the simple fact that people stopped caring who sat on the throne by the time the Old Kingdom had truly faded into silence. Egypt was no longer a single body ruled by one heart. It had become many organs beating in isolation, each nome pulsing with its own rhythm, cause, gods, and loyalties. This was the first intermediate period, a name modern historians give to what the ancient scribes called simply the time of the Na. Great forgetting was a time of broken roads and paper kings. In some nomes, especially in Upper Egypt, leaders like Entefi and his successors began engraving their own names in stone, tracing lineages not to the sun god Ra or the divine Horus, but to their fathers and uncles, landowners, warlords, or priests. Power, once divine, had become human again. In Heracleopolis, a competing dynasty emerged, claiming to carry the legacy of the Old Kingdom. Their rulers issued royal proclamations, rebuilt temples, and tried to re-establish the central administration, but their reach rarely extended beyond the surrounding provinces. South of Asayat, their names were barely known. Still, they tried. Both Heracleopolis and thieves dreamed of unification, not in the name of the old pharaohs, but in their own. Egypt, fractured and bleeding, still had a pulse. Somewhere beneath the chaos, the people still remembered what it felt like to be one, and that memory, more than anything else, became the battlefield. Skirmishes were frequent. No single war marked the era, just a slow grind of territorial contests, shifting alliances, and forgotten bloodshed. One town would pledge loyalty to Heraclipolis in the morning, only to swear fealty to Thebes by dusk. Grain was the currency of war. Armies followed the food, not the banners, but for most Egyptians, life was neither war nor peace, which was waiting for the Nile to return, waiting for a leader who could speak not in the voice of men, Kana, but in the voice of the gods. And one day, that voice returned. His name was Mentuhotep II. He came not from Memphis or Heraclipolis, but from Thebes, a place once considered peripheral. He was not born into grandeur. His ancestors were regional lords, but he brought with him something the old kingdom had long lost, a vision. Over a slow and calculated campaign, Mentuhotep II subdued his rivals, not with overwhelming force, but with steady persistence. He forged alliances with priests, honored the old gods, and restored crumbling temples. Oh, when he entered Heraclipolis, not as a conqueror, but as a reconciler, he did something pharaohs had not done in over a century. He listened, and in doing so, he reignited something older than power, belief. The Middle Kingdom was born not as a return to the past, but as a resurrection built from its ruins. But it is here, precisely at the moment of reformation, that the story of the Old Kingdom truly ends, because what followed was not a continuation, but a reinvention. No longer would kings rely solely on the divine aura of their names. Now, they would maintain military garrisons in the nomes. They would pay attention to tax records, irrigation dikes, and grain storage. They would monitor the behavior of priests and ensure scribes kept curing archives. The God King had become a working king, and perhaps that was the most lasting legacy of the Old Kingdom's fall. It taught Egypt that eternity was a lie, that even pyramids crumble, that even gods fall silent when the river dries. But it also taught resilience. People still planted, even when the soil was poor. They still recorded, even when no one read. They still whispered the names of the gods, even when the temples collapsed. And that quiet perseverance, the insistence on living, even when divine order disappeared, what carried Egypt forward. So when Mentuhotep II unified the land, the people did not erupt in joy. There were no great celebrations, no citywide festivals, just silence, the kind that comes when the rain finally returns after years of dust, and maybe the canals filled again. Someone, somewhere, perhaps a farmer, perhaps a scribe, murmured the old titles of kings, long gone, Horus, mighty bull, lord of the said festival, ... It's words spoken not in faith, but in memory. And from that memory, Egypt rose again, but it would never again believe that kings were gods. What, then, truly ended the Egyptian pharaohs of the Old Kingdom? Not war, not invasion, not plague, but time, silence, and the forgetting of names. A long unraveling in the space between one flood and the next. Asterisk. Imagine a scroll, not a sacred hymn or a royal decree, a dusty sheet of papyrus unrolled by a clerk near the riverbank. On it are columns of numbers: grain owed, copper paid, linen issued, beer allocated. This is not the Egypt of pyramids or golden death masks. This is the Egypt of inventory, quiet, methodical, and suffocatingly precise. It is 1900 BCE. It's the height of the Middle Kingdom, and Egypt is ruled by a pharaoh named Senusret III. He is powerful, ambitious, and determined to restore the greatness lost during the chaos of the first intermediate period. Under his watch, the canals are dredged. The borders are fortified. The temple granaries are stocked once again, and every single action is recorded. The scribes of the Middle Kingdom were not poets. They were accountants. They walked through towns with reed pens and waxed tablets, caning homes, counting livestock, weighing grain, and recording every child born. Taxes were no longer seasonal obligations. They were routine, okay? They reached deep into every village, temple, and estate. It was efficient, it was thorough, and it was exhausting. This was the bureaucratic revolution of Egypt, the belief that divine order could be maintained not through pyramid building or celestial myths, but through paperwork. Senusret III's reign is often remembered as one of discipline and centralization. He broke the power of the nomarchs who had once divided the country. He sent administrators to the farthest nomes, built a network of checkpoints, and imposed strict auditing on temple economies. Even the priests, once autonomous, were now accountable to royal inspectors. On the surface, it worked. Egypt grew wealthy again. Trade with the Levant expanded. Expeditions brought back turquoise and copper from Sinai, cedar from Byblus, and exotic animals from Nubia. Fortresses lined the southern border. Roads connected provincial towns to central depots. Grain moved more smoothly than ever before, but beneath the polished order was a system straining under its own weight. Every new reform brought new administrators. Every new ledger demanded a new level of compliance. Farmers found themselves buried under obligations they could not escape. A poor harvest did not excuse the tax, it only increased the penalties. Missed quotas meant confiscation, and in some nomes, it meant forced labor. Even the temples, pillars of spiritual life, became entangled in debt. Priests, who once ruled over vast estates with divine autonomy, now owed accounts to royal clerks. Temple lands were subdivided, taxed, and overseen. Rituals were scheduled to accommodate audits. Offerings became currency. Incense became inventory. You can imagine the weight of it's a slow erosion of meaning in every sacred act. A prayer is no longer a gift to the gods. It is a line item in a ledger, and over time, the burden of maintaining divine order became indistinguishable from the burden of serving the state. For the common worker, this meant long hours of corvée labor, repairing canals, quarrying stone, carrying papyrus bales across the desert. These weren't massive pyramid building projects, just endless, repetitive tasks, quiet, monotonous, boring, and all of it was done not for glory, but to keep the system from collapsing. But systems don't last forever. When Senusret III died, his son Amenhotep III inherited a kingdom at its peak wealthy, organized, and disciplined. But like all systems stretched too thin, could not adapt. A string of low floods hit in the latter years of Amenhotep III's reign. Not as catastrophic as those that ended the Old Kingdom, but enough to matter. Farmers began defaulting on taxes. The royal granaries emptied faster than they filled. Priests postponed festivals for lack of supplies. Some temples, desperate for revenue, began renting their sacred land to private citizens, thinkable in the centuries before. And in a state where everything depended on numbers, the numbers stopped making sense. Scrolls began to contradict one another. Audits were falsified. Scribes took bribes to underreport yields. In one archive near Elahan, a scribe named Akhenaten wrote bitterly of men who would rather erase a debt than break a stone. In this age, corruption wasn't defiance, was survival. The people didn't rise up. They simply worked slower, spoke less, caved less, and in silence, the system began to break down. But the temples still held their ceremonies. The officials still filed their reports. Pharaoh Amenhotep III still received tributes in his polished court, unaware, perhaps unwilling to admit that the flow of grain behind the ceremony had already begun to dry up. One cannot help but wonder what happens when divine order is reduced to math, and what happens when the math no longer adds up. It's asterisk, the numbers kept coming, even when the fields dried, even when the priests could no longer afford incense, even when the children of canal diggers grew too sick to work. The scribes still came meek, pots in hand, ledgers open. It was the middle years of Amenhotep's reign, and the temple economy was beginning to fracture. In theory, temples were sacred, protected, independent, but under the weight of the new bureaucracy, they had become financial machines expected to produce surplus, to feed state coffers, to loan and borrow like banks. This shift did not happen overnight. At first, it was simple. Temples were taxed less than other estates, but they had to record their donations. Then came the audits, then the quotas, then the demands. Now, temple priests spent as much time with receipts as they did with prayer scrolls. In the sprawling temple complex of Sobek at Crocodile Palace, clay storage jars that once held sacred oils were now filled with scribbled tablets and grain receipts. A high priest, once revered as the living voice of a god, now answered to a minor tax officer from the 13th nome, and this officer, not a pharaoh, not a general, could shut the temple down for accounting irregularities. The priests, of course, began to adapt. Some quietly moved assets into hidden cellars. Others sold old temple lands to trusted families. A few entered into quiet alliances with local village leaders to shield their stocks from audit, but most simply bent their heads and complied. The fear of punishment was stronger than the memory of divinity. The people noticed data in village after village. The festivals grew smaller. The processions of sacred animals were shortened. The music, once thunderous and hypnotic, gave way to flute, solos, and hushed drums. Where once thousands had gathered to praise the gods, now a few dozen knelt in silence, but no one protested, not aloud. Instead, they whispered that the gods were tired, that the pharaoh no longer heard them. Pop's Matawater was breaking, KC bred by invisible thread, and this whispering, more than famine, more than taxation, was what truly scared the state, because the pharaoh, in the Middle Kingdom, was not just a ruler, he was the guardian of Mat. His legitimacy depended not just on wealth, but on cosmic order. If people stopped believing he maintained that order, then even the most detailed audit couldn't save him, so the court doubled down. Amenhotep III commissioned enormous building projects, not for tombs, but for order, expanded the Fayum region with massive irrigation channels. He built the so-called labyrinth at Horra, sprawling administrative complex intended to house thousands of officials, priests, and scribes. The labyrinth was not a palace. It was a paper machine, a place for records, not rituals. Its halls were silent except for the scratch of reed pens. Its chambers were lined not with gold, but with stone shelves for ledgers. It was meant to stabilize Egypt. It became a monument to its drowning. Outside its walls, the Nile remained uncertain, not dry, but unreliable. A good year followed a bad. Canal collapsed. A village lost its crop. Grain prices soared. But the scribes still recorded their columns, still demanded taxes, still believed that numbers could tame the flood. Inside the temples, dissent brewed slowly. A group of priests in Dendora circulated a copy of a prophetic poem, The Complaints of Kakapayazam, which lamented the inversion of divine order. In it, the poet claims, "The wise are silent, the fool speaks, the sacred is defiled." And what was hidden is now sold in the street. It was not a rebellion. It was not sedition. It was despair. And this despair began to spread, especially as Amenhotep III aged. His final years were marked by sickness and increasing isolation. Court records suggest his speech became erratic. Royal decrees were delayed. Scribal errors increased. Some speculate he was blind by the end. Others think he simply stopped listening power. Once centralized in the pharaoh, began again to drift outward, this time not to warlords or foreign invaders, but to clerks. When Amenhotep III died, his successor, Amenhotep IV, inherited a well-organized but hollowed-out kingdom. And this was the final stage of the Middle Kingdom, the appearance of strength masking internal decay. Amenhotep IV reigned for only 9 years. His sister, Sobonfiru, the first known woman to rule as pharaoh in her own right, lasted 4. After her death, no heir remained. The 13th dynasty began in name only. Dozens of kings followed, each weaker than the last, some reigning only months. Their names are known, but barely etched onto broken stele, scrawled hastily into temple walls. Egypt was still ruled, but no one listened to the rulers anymore. Local governors resumed power. Grain lords became judges. Some villages ceased communication with Memphis entirely. They had their own gods now, their own leaders, their own rituals, and the pharaoh. Just another name on a tax record no one bothered to read. All of this leads to the quietest of collapses. No fires, no revolts, just silence. And so we ask, what breaks first, the king's treasury or the people's belief that the treasury matters at all? Asterisk, the records continued. That's what makes it strange. Even as the Middle Kingdom died, papyrus scrolls kept being written, audited, and stored. Kings, whose names are nearly lost, still issued tax decrees. Priests still cataloged offerings, even when the altars were bare. The system, even as it crumbled, insisted on pretending it was whole. You could walk through a town in the 13th dynasty and find everything seemingly in order. There was a tax office, a temple, a governor's house, farmers harvesting barley, a tay. But something had changed, quietly, deeply. The pharaoh, once a divine figure who unified the heavens and the earth, was now just a voice on a document, a seal stamped by someone the villagers would never meet. He was invisible. That invisibility became fatal. The people had not forgotten the Middle Kingdom's rise. They remembered sinews writs, campaigns, omen hats, irrigation projects, and the sense, however temporary, that Egypt had returned to order after centuries of division. But now they watched, again, as the structure unraveled. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, that's what made it worse. In the absence of a clear catastrophical single war, no plague, no foreign invasion, the decay felt like something in the air, a fog no one could name. The rulers of the 13th dynasty were many. Some historians list over 50 kings in just 150 years. Most ruled for a year, some for only months. One king, Merhotep Ini, is known from a single scarab seal. His name means beloved of the peace of Ra. But what peace? What rule? The throne had become a chair in an empty room. Meanwhile, power slipped into other hands. Local chieftains grew bolder. Priests began selecting their own successors, bypassing the crown. In some nomes, minor warlords set up tolls on river trade. Others built walled estates and quietly cut off tax shipments to the capital. The state, once a vast machine of ledgers and laws, began operating on autopilot papers still filled out. But no one reading. It was during this time that a foreign group began to settle in Egypt's eastern delta, the Hyksos. At first, they came as traders, Semitic-speaking people from the Levant, bringing new tools, livestock, and weapons. They introduced new crops, new bronze work, new horse-drawn carts. Egypt welcomed them. It needed labor. It needed merchants, but it also needed protection. And that's where the Hyksos gained ground. As local officials fought for influence, and weak kings played ceremonial roles. The Hyksos did something different. They built fortresses. They organized it. Eventually, they claimed kingship in the north. It wasn't a conquest at first. It was a vacuum. They filled it. Back in the south, Thebes remained loyal to the old gods and the old ways. But their pharaohs no longer ruled the two lands. They ruled a fragment, a memory. One Theban priest, writing in this period, offers a chilling metaphor. We walk through ruins that pretend to be cities. That is the legacy of the late Middle Kingdom. Not destruction, but pretense. Temples still rang with hymns, but the gods felt far away. Taxes were still collected, but never reached the palace. Kings still sat on thrones, but made no laws. And the people, they adapted, quietly, patiently, endlessly. They stopped relying on Memphis, stopped expecting salvation. They turned to local alliances, family bonds, village rituals. In some places, old gods were merged with new ones. In others, household deities replaced distant pantheons. It was in rebellion. It was practical theology, and so the pharaoh's voice grew fainter, not silenced, tuned out. By the time the Hyksos officially seized control in the north, many Egyptians barely noticed. The rulers had already become foreign in spirit, long before they became foreign in blood, and yet, deep in Thebes, something stirred. A line of Theban kings began to rise, not in power, but in purpose. They weren't rich. They weren't recognized. But they remembered. They remembered what it meant for Egypt to be one. That memory would one day lead to revolt, to reunification, to the new kingdom. But that is another story. This story ends in silence. Squilled kings, with scrolls that no one opened, with ledgers full of debts that would never be paid. And it leaves us with a quiet question. Is a pharaoh truly gone when he dies, or when no one remembers what he ruled for? You hear the hoofbeats before you see them, not the thunder of war horses or the clash of steel, just a new rhythm on the well-worn earth. The sound of carts drawn by animals no one in Egypt had ever seen move like that before. A creaking, unfamiliar procession of wheels and bronze. It is the 17th century BCE, and change is not coming with fire, but with wagons. The Hyksos arrived. Gradually, they did not storm the borders or descend with armies. At first, they came as traders. Small groups, likely from Akhenaten and the broader Levantan corridor, entered Egypt through the eastern delta. Their accents were strange. Their gods had unfamiliar names. But they brought what Egypt, tired and fragmented, needed: tools, labor, copper, livestock, and perhaps most importantly horses. And Egypt welcomed them, not as invaders, but as migrants. For generations, Egypt had survived on the memory of what it had once been. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom left a patchwork of city-states, priesthoods, and tax collectors operating without a unifying force. The pharaohs of the 13th dynasty still existed on paper, but in practice, few obeyed them. The Delta region, the northernmost expanse of Egypt, was especially vulnerable. Marshy terrain and open borders had always been difficult to police. In a time when kings changed every year and temples pleaded for donations, no one had the energy to manage immigration. The Hyksos didn't need to conquer. They simply stayed, and over time, it began to build. They established settlements first near Avaris, a city whose importance would soon eclipse many traditional capitals. There, they constructed fortifications, built harbors, established markets, and minted their own authority in subtle ways. They paid taxes, hired Egyptians, even donated to temples. And yet, something had shifted. They brought with them composite bows, unfamiliar metalwork, and the horse-drawn chariot. Not just new tools, but new ways of thinking about war, mobility, and statecraft. In Egypt, with its long reliance on infantry and spearmen, to not immediately grasp what this meant. At first, Egyptian officials tolerated the changes. They had little choice. The central government was too weak, and many local governors found it easier to negotiate than to resist. Treaties were made, marriages arranged. In some areas, Egyptian and Hyksos elites shared feast days and scribes. The Hyksos called themselves Hatshepsut, rulers of foreign lands. Egyptian scribes shortened this to Hyksos. They did not erase Egyptian culture. They absorbed it. Their kings adopted Egyptian royal titles. They worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own. They wore Egyptian clothing and buried their dead in Egyptian-style tombs. To the casual observer, little had changed, but power had moved from Memphis to Avars, from Theban temples to Hyksos forts, from pharaohs to foreign kings who claimed no divine mandate, only control. And in this strange twilight, Egypt lived on. The fields were still planted. The Nile still flooded. Scribes still filled papyrus with hymns to Ra and Thoth. But above all of it loomed a growing unease. Because although the Hyksos acted Egyptian, they ruled differently. They taxed differently. Trained soldiers differently. They built defensive architecture no Egyptian had ever seen. Walls not for ceremony, but for siege. In one record, an Egyptian scribe writes bitterly, "They speak our language, but do not know our gods. They bow to Ra, but bring their own son, Khet." No army rose to meet them. No grand council was summoned, because Egypt no longer had the strength to resist, because too many had grown used to obedience without understanding. And so, we ask, was this an invasion? Heard, just a quiet surrender, dressed in trade. Asterisk. Imagine a crowned, golden, radiant, resting on the brow of a king. Now, imagine that king speaks a language not born of the Nile. He offers wine to Egyptian gods, but does not carry the blood of Horus. His crown is Egyptian, but his authority comes from elsewhere, from soldiers, from walls, from fear. This is the rule of the Hyksos by the mid-17th century BCE. The Hyksos had established a firm capital at Avaris, a thriving city in the northeastern delta. It was unlike any Egyptian capital before it closer to a military encampment than a ritual center. Its walls were thick. Its streets were foreign. Its temples were small, practical, often dual-purpose places of worship that could also become places of defense. From Avaris, Hyksos kings ruled Lower Egypt with both caution and efficiency. They did not outlaw Egyptian customs. They co-opted them. They took on the title of pharaoh, but not the divine soul of Egyptian kingship. They did not claim descent from the gods. They did not build massive pyramids or speak of Mat as cosmic truth. They ruled by presence, not principle. This was something new and deeply unsettling to the Egyptians of the south. In Thebes, a shrinking city, still clinging to old traditions, local kings refused to recognize the Hyksos as legitimate. These kings came Skamos, Sikinina, and later Amos held little territory, but carried a large burden. Memory. They remembered a time before the Hyksos. Their scribes copied old royal hymns. Their temples reperformed rituals once thought eternal. Their people whispered prayers to gods who now felt very far away. But loyalty to memory is not the same as power. The southern kings had little access to the trade wealth of the north. Their military was outdated foot soldiers with simple shields and spears. Their temples, though spiritually rich, were materially poor. And yet, resistance began not with swords, but with scribes. The earliest sign of rebellion was not an ambush, but a letter. A preserved document from Kamosi's reign recounts his disdain for the Hyksos' presence. He refers to the land as divided between two kings, one in Avaris and one in Thebes. In his words, I sit joined with an Asiatic and a Nubian, every man with his portion of Egypt. This is not the voice of a conqueror. It is the voice of a man shamed, and that shame was enough to spark something. Kamos's court began training in secrecy. They studied the Hyksos' weapons, imitated their tactics, and eventually challenged their messengers. Minor raids began along the borderlands. Traders loyal to avarice were intercepted. Granaries were looted, not for wealth, but to starve the enemy. Kamos launched a brief military campaign northward. He claimed to have reached the borders of Avaris, though no battle is recorded. What matters is that someone tried. The reaction from the Hyksos court was one of annoyance, not fear. They mocked the southern kings as rebels, not rulers. They believed their control was inevitable, but inevitability is brittle. Inside Thebes, the priests supported Kamos more openly. They interpreted his resistance as a restoration of Mat. Offerings increased. The people, though poor, began to sing old hymns with new conviction. And in the space between memory and action, hope began to bloom. Kamos died before he could truly challenge the Hyksos. His successor, Sekenen Adao, took up the cause. His name means the brave. He would be remembered not for victory, but for a wound. A skull found at Thebes, believed to be his, shows violent trauma. Deep gashes above the eye, at the base of the neck. He likely died in battle or in capture. Either way, it was a bloody end, but it was not the end of the story. His son, Amosai, would rise in his place. He was young, unproven, and poor, but he had what the Hyksos lacked, faith, not just in gods, but in memory. He reorganized the Theban army, sought new weapons, forged alliances with Nubia, and in time, he would mount a campaign that would drive the Hyksos from Egypt completely. But not yet. For now, Egypt remained a split of foreign king and avarice, a resistant house in Thebes, and silence in between. And still, the Nile flowed, the seasons changed, the scribes recorded, but no one knew where Egypt truly lived anymore in the ledgers of avarice or in the prayers of Thebes. And so, we ask, is a land still conquered if its people remember what it used to be? Asterisk, the river runs quietly past Thebes. It has done so for thousands of years, carrying silt and memory in equal measure. But now, something else floats with it, a whisper of war. The Hyksos still hold the north. They sit in avarice behind high walls and guarded gates. Their kings wear Egyptian crowns, speak Egyptian phrases, even pray to Egyptian gods. But in the hearts of Egyptians, especially those in the south, they are still seen as something else. Not evil, not monstrous, just not Egypt. And that quiet dissonance has become unbearable. The year is around 1550 BCE. A boy named Amos the first inherits a dream. His father, Siknian Tawi, died violently. Ataya, violently. His brother, Kamos, died unfinished. But Amos is patient. He watches, he learns, and he waits for the moment when memory becomes momentum. It comes slowly. He rebuilds the army, not by raising legions of conscripts, but by modernizing. The Hyksos had chariots, so Amos makes chariots of his own. They had bronze weapons. Amos seeks new mines, new forges, new craftsmen. He studies their tactics, learns their weaknesses. He does not declare war with a flourish. He begins with a siege. First, he targets Hyksos-held forts along the Nile. Small victories. Each one returns grain and ground to Thebes. Then he moves toward Avaris. The siege lasts years. Avaris is not just a capital, it is a fortress, surrounded by marshes, protected by high walls, guarded by men who have never known defeat in Egypt. But Amos persists. He cuts supply lines, recruits foreign mercenaries, maintains pressure, and in the meantime, he writes, or rather, his scribes do. They issue proclamations, not just of victory, but of restoration, of cleansing. the return of the cosmic order that only a true Egyptian king can protect. This is not just a military campaign, it is a ritual of purification. Eventually, avarice falls. Its streets are emptied, its walls cracked open. The Hyksos king, Kamudi, vanishes from the records. No grand execution, no public humiliation, just disappearance swallowed by the silence of defeat. But Amos does not stop. He follows the fleeing remnants of the Hyksos eastward, to Canaan, into their homeland, not to conquer, but to send a message. Do not return. When he finally turns back, Egypt has changed. It is not just reunited. It is reborn. Amos is hailed not merely as a king, but as a cleanser, a restorer, the founder of a new dynasty, a pièce. Name becomes legend. His deeds are carved into stone. But the stones do not speak of rage or vengeance. They speak of balance, of rebuilding, of starting over. In the years that follow, Amos repairs temples, reopens canals, expands trade. He rewards loyal officials with land not for power, but for service. He encourages marriage alliances, fortifies borders, and, crucially, listens to his priests. Egypt becomes whole again, not through fear, but through attention. And yet, the memory of the Hyksos lingers, not in fear, but in architecture. New cities are built with better defenses. Forts are improved. Military training becomes standardized. The state begins to watch its borders more closely. Scribal schools begin including stories of the Hyksos as cautionary tales, not of evil outsiders, of what happens when Egypt forgets itself. But the greatest change, kingship, no longer is it assumed to be eternal or unbreakable. The pharaoh now must earn his divinity, not just through birth, but through competence. The divine rule that once collapsed under debt, silence, is now reborn through clarity and labor. And so Amos dies not as a myth, but as a remembered man, king, whose greatest victory was not the fall of avarice, but the reawakening of belief. Egypt would go on to enter its most powerful era, the new kingdom and age of vast temples, colossal statues, and military conquest. But it all began with a boy who remembered the silence and dared to break it. What ended the Hyksos? Not a flood, not a rebellion, a memory held by a southern city, by a wounded family, by scribes and priests and farmers who never stopped whispering the name of Egypt. And so we end with this question: can a kingdom ever truly fall if its people keep remembering how it felt to stand whole? Asterisk, you are standing before a wall of stone, sunlit, warm, carved in perfect lines. The figure on the wall wears the false beard of a king. Her arms hold offerings to Amun-Ra. Her face, serene and eternal, looks out not with softness, but with command. Her name is Hatshepsut, and she is not supposed to be here. It is the 15th century BCE, in the early years of Egypt's new kingdom. The Hyksos are gone. The kings of the 18th dynasty are expanding their borders. Temples flourish again. Tombs deepen beneath the valley of the kings. Statues grow taller. And yet, at the center of all this power stands a woman, Pharaoh. Not a queen, not a consort, not a regent, but Pharaoh. This in Egypt is rare. Not impossible. There were others before, but rare enough to be unsettling. And what made Hatshepsut remarkable wasn't just that she ruled, it's that she ruled well. But her rise was quiet, careful, and cloaked in ritual. She began, like many royal women, as a daughter of a king Thutmose the first. When he died, his heir, Thutmose II, took the throne. Hatshepsut married him, her half-brother. It was custom, not love. Theirs was a union meant to preserve bloodline, not affection. But Thutmose II was weak, sickly. He ruled briefly and died young. His heir, Thutmose III, was a child born to a minor wife, not old enough to reign, not strong enough to command. And into that gap, Hatshepsut stepped. At first, she was regent governing on behalf of the child. She stood behind the throne, signed decrees, managed festivals. But over time, she began to shift the language. She called herself King's principal wife, then God's wife of Amen. Then, without ceremony, she claimed the ultimate title, Pharaoh, not female Pharaoh, not Queen Regent, just Pharaoh. She ordered statues carved of herself broad-shouldered, chin lifted, adorned with a royal beard. She appeared in male form in inscriptions, but retained female pronouns in prayers. She blended gender, identity, and ritual in two, something Egypt had never quite seen before. And she ruled efficiently, diligently, without scandal. She rebuilt temples destroyed during the Hyksos era, commissioned new ones at Karnak, repaired trade routes, strengthened priesthoods. The state ran smoothly. Creteries were full. The Nile obeyed. But her greatest achievement was not war. Crete was Punt. The expedition to the land of Punta, semi-mythical region far to the south. Perhaps modern-day Somalia was one of the most ambitious state-sponsored journeys of the age. She sent fleets of ships filled with trade goods, incense, gold, wine, cloth. They returned with treasures Egypt had not seen in generations: frankincense trees, myrrh, resin, rare animals, and exotic woods. Reliefs in her temple at Deir el-Bahari show bearded men of Punt, curved huts on stilts, and the image of the Queen of Punt, short, wide, and richly adorned. This was not conquest. It was diplomacy, exchange, soft power, and Egypt remembered. Hatshepsut built her legacy in stone. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of the most elegant structures in Egypt, tiered, columned, carved with scenes of her reign, not in glory, but in ritual offerings, processions, and journeys across desert and sea. She ruled for over 20 years, peacefully, prosperously. But even as she built, she must have known it would not last. Not the power, and perhaps not even the memory, because her co-ruler, the boy she once protected, Akhenaten, III, was grown, and he had been waiting. The temple is silent now. The offerings have been cleared. The priests have finished their chants. And in the stillness of its cool stone corridors, one figure remains young, sharp-eyed. And watching the walls, he is Thutmose III, and everywhere he looks, he sees her. The reliefs show Hatshepsut as pharaoh arms, outstretched in divine posture, crowned, powerful, eternal. But these walls were meant for him. The throne, the titles, the temples, all of it had been inherited by her, not stolen, not usurped, but held nonetheless. And now, the boy king, who once waited in the shadow of his stepmother, begins to take it all back. Thutmose III did not rise in a blaze of revenge. He was no tyrant. He did not execute Hatshepsut's officials, did not defile her tomb. In fact, in the early years of his sole reign, he continued many of her policies, honoring temple obligations, maintaining her building projects, and even expanding some. But beneath the surface, something colder began, a quiet dismantling. One by one, Hatshepsut's names were chiseled off her monuments. Her cartouches, those sacred name rings inscribed in stone, were scraped away. Statues bearing her likeness were toppled, buried, or recarved to resemble other kings. Some temples were altered to show Thutmose's lineage uninterrupted, as if she had never ruled at all. Not obliteration, not destruction. Erasure. It is this erasure that defines the final phase of Hatshepsut's story, because it was not immediate, it was not public. It came decades after her death. This was not an emotional reaction. It was a political correctional, ritual rewriting of a past that had become inconvenient to the priests and scribes of Thutmose's mature reign. The idea of a woman pharaoh was an aberration, not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. She had rewritten the rules, and now the rules wanted to write back. The motive was not hatred. It was consistency. Egypt had just endured generations of chaos, foreign occupation, and divine silence. The new kingdom was a chance to restore order, and in that order, there was no place for blurred lines. Kings were male. Lines of succession were clean. The story of Egypt had to move forward smoothly, and so they smoothed her away in Deir el-Bahari, where Hatshepsut's elegant temple once rang with processions. Many of her reliefs were carved over. In some, she was replaced with Thutmose's image. In others, the space was simply left blank. It is the blankness that speaks loudest, because it tells us that even greatness temple building, God-honoring, peace-bringing greatness can be swallowed by silence if it doesn't fit the narrative that follows. And yet, not all traces vanished in hidden corners of Karnak, behind fallen walls, in the backs of neglected tombs. Her name survived. A half-scraped cartouche, a statue too heavy to move, scratched out line that, with enough light, could still be read. And, in those remnants, a new story began, not of a pharaoh who was forgotten, but of one who refused to disappear. Centuries later, Greek historians writing of Egyptian kings included no mention of Hatshepsut. Her story was unknown to them. 2 later generations. The gap in the royal lineage seemed accidental. It wasn't until the 19th century, thousands of years after her death, that archaeologists began to piece together the truth. They found her tomb, her inscriptions, her erased images. They retranslated the old names, reconstructed the smashed statues, and realized there had been a woman, king, and she had ruled with brilliance. But even then, debates lingered. Was she power-hungry or pious? Was her reign legitimate or temporary? Did she take what wasn't hers or hold what no one else could manage? Perhaps the questions themselves are flawed because the more we learn about her, the clearer it becomes. She did not try to be a man. She tried to be a pharaoh. And in doing so, she forced Egypt to face a truth it could not admit, not then, and maybe not now. That greatness does not always look like tradition. Desert forgets quickly, but the stone does not. Hatshepsut's tomb lies in the Valley of the Kings, where sunlit silence rests over ancient rock. Carved deep into a cliffside, it was designed with care, not to boast, but to endure. Not just a burial site, but a message in architecture. I was here. I ruled. I mattered. 4 centuries, her name was hidden. Even her mummy, when rediscovered, thousands of years later, lay in anonymity, moved, mislabeled, her identity forgotten, until forensic science caught a faint whisper in her bones. A lost tooth, a matching DNA thread, a silent human clue to a royal life once covered in gold and now reduced to fragments. She had been erased, but incompletely, because the act of erasure itself left fingerprints. When Thutmose III and his successors tried to scrub her name from the stone, they couldn't remove everything. Statues buried instead of destroyed, paintings altered but not repainted, walls scratched but not broken. They could not bring themselves to destroy her completely, perhaps out of reverence, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because even those who erased her still knew she had done something remarkable. Let us return to her works. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari still rises from the cliffs in long terraces, perfectly symmetrical, covered in carved scenes of her divine birth, her voyage to Punt, and her presentation before Amun-Ra. These were not modest claims. They were declarations. She was more than ruler. Even the story of her divine birth, carved in detail on temple walls, was bold. She claimed that Amun himself had come to her mother, disguised as her father, to conceive her. That she was, therefore, both royal and divine, not by lineage, but by divine will. This was more than mythology. It was politics. It was protection, because Hatshepsut knew, perhaps better than anyone, that to rule as a woman in Egypt was not just red, was dangerous. Egyptians were not blind to the idea of female power. They worshipped Isis, queen of the gods, Hathor, goddess of fertility and music, and Mat, the very embodiment of cosmic balance. But divine femininity and political authority were two different languages. Hatshepsut spoke both. She built temples for Mat, and then governed like Ra. She honored her gods, then became one, and for that, she was made invisible. But only for a while, because centuries later, when Egypt's history was being rediscovered by archaeologists, linguists, and explorers, Hatshepsut's story began to return not in glory, but in question. Why was her name removed? Why were her statues buried instead of smashed? Why did so many officials remain loyal throughout her reign? These questions linger because they reveal something deeper. That power was held well, cannot be fully undone. Today, historians recognize her as one of Egypt's greatest builders. Her reign was marked not by war, but by economic strength, artistic refinement, and architectural elegance. She brought prosperity without conquest, stability without spectacle. Her temples were clean, her policies effective, her image crafted not from dominance, but from discipline. And in a world where rulers often shout to be heard, she ruled in a voice of calm, a clear purpose. That voice was silenced, but not destroyed, because the attempt to erase her is what preserved her. The scratches, the blank cartouches, the altered reliefs, these are what tell us she was powerful enough to threaten memory itself. And what is memory if not a kind of resistance? So we ask, in this quiet ending, what does it mean to win if your story is buried? Hey, and what does it mean to lose if your silence still speaks through stone? Asterisk, the desert forgets quickly, but the stone does not. Hatshepsut's tomb lies in the Valley of the Kings, where sunlit silence rests over ancient rock. Carved deep into a cliffside, it was designed with care not to boast, but to endure. Not just a burial site, but a message in architecture. I was here. I ruled. I mattered. 4 centuries, her name was hidden. Even her mummy, when rediscovered, thousands of years later, lay in anonymity, moved, mislabeled, her identity forgotten, until forensic science caught a faint whisper in her bones. A lost tooth, a matching DNA thread, a silent human clue to a royal life once covered in gold and now reduced to fragments. She had been erased, but incompletely, because the act of erasure itself left fingerprints. When Thutmose III and his successors tried to scrub her name from the stone, they couldn't remove everything. Statues buried instead of destroyed, paintings altered but not repainted, walls scratched but not broken. They could not bring themselves to destroy her completely, perhaps out of reverence, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because even those who erased her still knew. She had done something remarkable. Let us return to her works. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari still rises from the cliffs in long terraces, perfectly symmetrical, covered in carved scenes of her divine birth, her voyage to Punt, and her presentation before Amun-Ra. These were not modest claims. They were declarations. Squeeze. She was more than ruler. Squeeze. Even the story of her divine birth, carved in detail on temple walls, was bold. She claimed that Amun himself had come to her mother, disguised as her father, to conceive her. That she was, therefore, both royal and divine, not by lineage, but by divine will. This was more than mythology. It was politics. It was protection, because Hatshepsut knew, perhaps better than anyone, that to rule as a woman in Egypt was not just red, was dangerous. Egyptians were not blind to the idea of female power. They worshipped Isis, queen of the gods, Hathor, goddess of fertility and music, and Mat, the very embodiment of cosmic balance. But divine femininity and political authority were two different languages. Hatshepsut spoke both. She built temples for Mat, and then governed like Ra. She honored her gods, then became one, and for that, she was made invisible. But only for a while, because centuries later, when Egypt's history was being rediscovered by archaeologists, linguists, and explorers, Hatshepsut's story began to return not in glory, but in question. Why was her name removed? Why were her statues buried instead of smashed? Why did so many officials remain loyal throughout her reign? These questions linger because they reveal something deeper. That power was held well, cannot be fully undone. Today, historians recognize her as one of Egypt's greatest builders. Her reign was marked not by war, but by economic strength, artistic refinement, and architectural elegance. She brought prosperity without conquest, stability without spectacle. Her temples were clean, her policies effective, her image crafted not from dominance, but from discipline. And in a world where rulers often shout to be heard, she ruled in a voice of calm, a clear purpose. That voice was silenced, but not destroyed, because the attempt to erase her is what preserved her. The scratches, the blank cartouches, the altered reliefs, these are what tell us she was powerful enough to threaten memory itself. And what is memory, if not a kind of resistance? So we ask, in this quiet ending, what does it mean to win if your story is buried? And what does it mean to lose if your silence still speaks through stone? Asterisk, you are standing in a city no one wanted. The wind whistles through empty colonnades. The statues are tall, thin, unnatural figures with elongated heads, sloping shoulders, soft, curved forms. They are not like the kings you've seen before. They are not like anything Egypt ever made. This is Akhenaten, the horizon of the sun disk. A city built from nothing by one man's will. A city raised not for the people, but for the Aten. And the man who built it was Akhenaten Pharaoh. Visionary, heretic. Asterisk, it begins not with fire, but with prayer. The 18th dynasty was strong. Egypt was rich, its empire wide, its temples full. But with power came complexity. Dozens of gods, hundreds of priests, layers of ritual and meaning wrapped around every moment of life. To live in Egypt was to navigate a spiritual web of man, Osiris, Thoth, Sekhmet, Ra, and hundreds more, each with temples, festivals, and obligations. And then came Amenhotep, for he was born into this maze, a prince of Thebes. He inherited not just the throne, but the burden of pleasing every god, of funding every priesthood, continuing a divine legacy built over millennia. But somewhere along the line, he said, no, asterisk. He changed his name. Amenhotep, amen, is satisfied, became Akhenaten, effective for the 18. And the 18 was not a god in the usual sense. It was the sun itself, not as a person, not as a falcon, not even as Ra, just a shining disk in the sky, radiating life. Akhenaten did not merely favor this god. He erased the others. Temples to a man were closed. Their priests stripped of power. Statues were smashed. Rings halted. The old gods, some of whom had ruled the Egyptian spirit for 1,500 years, were now illegal. The court was forced to follow. Scribes began writing hymns to the Aten, to poems that described sunlight falling like fingers upon the Nile. Artists reshaped. The royal family no longer stiff, formal figures, but tender, intimate scenes. Akhenaten is shown kissing his children, holding hands with his wife Nefertiti, lounging beneath rays that ended in tiny hands. It was beautiful, strange, soft, unsettling, and deeply disruptive. Akhenaten left Thebes, left Karnak, left the priesthoods, and the burden of inherited gods. He marched into the desert and found it. A new city, Akhenaten there. He would begin again. No temples of stone open-air courts, where the sun could reach the altar without obstruction. No dark sanctuaries. No holy statues, just sunlight. In this new capital, time itself changed. Art changed. Names changed. The people followed, some in obedience, others in fear, because Akhenaten was not just a reformer. He was a pharaoh. His word was law. And to resist him was to resist the very light of day. Yet resistance, like the gods, he tried to erase, never fully dies. In hidden corners of old temples, the names of Amen were covered, but not destroyed. Scribes scratched them out with haste, leaving them still visible beneath the damage. Some whispered old prayers in private. Some priests went into quiet exile. Even in Akhenaten, cracks formed. Food supplies were irregular. Temples lacked revenue. Foreign policy weakened. Letters from vassals in Canaan and Syria pleaded for help, warning of rebellion, famine, and collapse. But Akhenaten didn't respond. He remained focused on the Aten. The problems of the world where shadows only sunlight was real. And in that conviction, he built a kingdom of brilliance that could not last. Asterisk, the sun rises over Akheta, and it is quiet, too quiet for a royal capital. There are no temple drums, no chants for Osiris, no processions for the gods of death. Only the rustle of sand, the murmur of scribes recording praises to a single glowing disk in the sky. Akhenaten believed that the Aten was everywhere, that sunlight itself was sacred, that all life flowed from the warmth that touched the skin. So, why, in this city, so full of light, did everything begin to fall apart? Akhenaten was not built to last. Its walls were made of mud brick, its foundations shallow, its streets wide, ceremonial, but strangely empty. On the surface, life continued. Sculptors crafted new forms, curved, fluid, surreal. Women were portrayed as equals, sometimes even larger than the men. Nefertiti, the queen, was shown leading rituals, receiving offerings, crowned in the double plumes of power. The royal daughters danced in reliefs. Akhenaten's long head and narrow limbs were carved not in mockery, but in devotion and intentional shift away from divine perfection to a new, androgynous ideal. But underneath this spiritual revolution, Egypt itself was suffering. The great temples in Thebes and Karnak, once supported by tribute and labor from across the empire, had fallen into disuse. The priesthood of Amen, one of the most powerful religious institutions in the ancient world, was disbanded. With them went the managers of land, food, water, and festivals. In ancient Egypt, religion was not separate from infrastructure. Gods ran the state. When the gods were cast out, the administration began to fray. Letters from foreign rulers arrived in growing numbers. The Amarna letters, as they are now known, paint a portrait of a world unraveling. My Lord Pharaoh, we are attacked. The enemies grow bold. We have no gold, no soldiers, no food. Send help. Dozens of these letters survive. Most went unanswered. Akhenaten did not lead military campaigns. He sent no reinforcements. He appeared to have little interest in foreign affairs. His focus remained fixed on the Aten, on ritual purity, and on the ever-repeating cycle of the sun. It was as if he saw everything beyond Akhenaten as unreal. The light mattered. And so, the world slipped away. Egypt's vassals in Canaan began to fall. Cities that once paid tribute turned to rebellion. Trade routes weakened. Gold shipments slowed. And still, the hymns to Aten flowed. One such hymn, discovered in a tomb at Amarna, reads, "You rise in perfection on the eastern horizon of the sky. You fill every land with your beauty. Though you are far, Your rays touch the face of every man, beautiful, lyrical, radiant, but sunlight, though sacred, cannot feed a kingdom. Inside Akhenaten, famine may have begun to stir. Archaeological excavations reveal evidence of hurried burials of people buried without ceremony. The bones of workers show signs of malnutrition, overwork, and stress, and in the royal court, things became stranger still. Nefertiti, once central to Akhenaten's vision, disappears from the record. Some think she died. Others believe she was removed from power, possibly for questioning his rule. In her place, a new figure emerged, Smenkhare. Who was he? No one knows. Some say he was Akhenaten's brother. Others suggest he was Nefertiti, ruling under a new name. Some even propose he was a co-ruler or a ceremonial heir, but like so much in Akhenaten's court, the truth is missing. And then, in the 12th or 17th year of his reign, no one is certain Akhenaten died. No dramatic ending, no grand funeral, just silence. And in that silence, the Aten began to fade. Asterisk, the sun still rises over Akhenaten, but no one is watching anymore. The city, once the radiant center of a new theology, begins to collapse, not in flames, but in footsteps. Footsteps, walking away. Workers leave. Officials return to Thebes. The royal court, once filled with soft prayers and sharp doctrine, disperses like dust on the wind. Akhenaten is dead, and so is Akhenism. What followed is not entirely clear. Smenkhare ruled briefly, perhaps only a year. His name appears on a few artifacts, quickly scratched out and overwritten. He may have been a transitional figure, a final attempt to preserve Akhenaten's ideals, but it didn't work. Another figure rose in his place, a boy barely 9 years old. His name was Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten. He would later change everything. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, and in doing so, he undid what Akhenaten had spent a lifetime building. The gods returned dominant. Osiris, Isis, Thoth, given their festivals, their offerings, their voice. Temples were reopened, priests reappointed, old rituals dusted off and performed, once again with trembling gratitude. But it wasn't a full restoration, it was a repair, patching over of a theological rupture that had run deeper than anyone dared admit. Tutankhamun, though young and likely, guided by advisors, issued decrees reaffirming the old ways. He moved the court back to Thebes, commissioned statues, temples, and offerings to the gods of his ancestors. His tomb, though modest by royal standards, was filled with traditional imagery, no Aten rays, no sun discs reaching down like fingers. The gods had returned, but something had changed in the years that followed. Akhenaten's name was not just forgotten, it was condemned. His statues were smashed, his city left to rot. His cartouches were removed from royal lists. In official records, his reign was skipped over as though it never existed. This was not mere neglect. It was damnatio memoria, the deliberate erasure of memory. The priests, scribes, and kings who came after him saw Akhenaten's rule not just as a mistake, but as a wound, trauma, a break in the divine contract between king, God, and people. Egypt could not afford to remember, and so, for over 3,000 years, they didn't. Akhenaten disappeared beneath the sand. Its soft mud brick walls decayed, its inscriptions faded. Its art, so strange and delicate, was buried in silence. The city became a ghost, its king a whisper. It wasn't until the 19th century when archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins that the story returned. They found tablets, reliefs, letters. They found temples to Aten, statues of a pharaoh with sunken cheeks and arms outstretched to the sky. They found poems, prayers, hymns that seemed to worship nothing but the air. And they asked, who was this man? the answer is still debated. Was Akhenaten a religious genius, a proto-monotheist, a mystic king ahead of his time, okay? Or was he a failed radical, an egotist, blinded by obsession, okay? A ruler who abandoned his people for the purity of a theological dream? Perhaps he was all of these, but one thing is certain: he broke Egypt's rhythm. In Egypt, more than anything, was a civilization of rhythm of flood and harvest, day and night, birth and death, gods and men. Akhenaten disrupted that cycle. He flooded the desert with light and left nothing for the shadows. When the 18 said for the last time over his silent capital, even the sand seemed relieved, and yet the story lingers in the delicate hymns carved on broken tombs, in the fingerprints left on sun discs no one dared to touch again, in the face of his son, Tutankhamun, whose fame would eclipse his father's name entirely. But in the end, it was the silence that won. And so we ask, finally, can light be dangerous when it leaves no room for memory? He was only 9 when Tutankhamun took the throne. Egypt was wear exhausted by theological extremes, was confused by the absence of gods, and unsure whether the land itself had been cursed. The 18 had ruled for nearly 2 decades, casting shadows that reached deep into Egypt's temples, politics, and memory. A child sat on the throne. He was not a warrior. He had never commanded troops. He had been born in the surreal sunlight of Akhenaten, raised in a court that bowed to a disk in the sky. He had never known the old gods except through whispers. But Egypt needed more than strength. It needed stability. It needed a name it could hold on to. So the boy was given one, Tutankhamun, living image of Amen, and with that name, Egypt exhaled. The boy king did not act alone. Behind him stood powerful men, a seasoned courtier and advisor, and Horemheb, a military general with ambitions of his own. These men had lived through the reign of Akhenaten. They had watched temples close, priests scatter, and the people grow fearful. They knew what had been lost, and now, through the boy, they would bring it back. The return to tradition was not dramatic. It was methodical. Temples to Amen, Mut, and Khonsu were reopened. Priests were reappointed, many of them the same men who had been cast out. Festivals were revived, statues of old gods restored, and scribes instructed to erase all mention of the 18 from public texts. It was a restoration, yes, but also a regression. The dream of Akhenaten, however fragile, was buried, not debated, not examined, it's covered, and Tutankhamun became the symbol of Egypt's healing. The boy's reign was short, only 9 years, but in those years, Egypt returned to rhythm. Grain moved again. Temples echoed with chants once more. Pilgrims walked the old paths. The gods, absent for too long, were suddenly everywhere again, in walls, in hymns, in the hearts of people. But there was something hollow in it all, because the restoration was never whole. Akhenaten's city still stood, abandoned and crumbling in the desert. His art, so strange and soft, was quietly ignored. And though the priests of Amen returned to power, their grip was now weaker. A crack had formed in the illusion of permanence. The gods had once vanished, and people had survived. Something had shifted. Tutankhamun married his half-sister, Hatshepsut, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. It was a union meant to repair the broken lineage. Their rule, ceremonial and scripted, tried to stitch together the divine narrative that had come undone. But the boy was not strong. He suffered from congenital health problems, likely the result of generations of royal inbreeding. He walked with a cane, had a clubbed foot, suffered from malaria, and then, at age 18 or 19, he died. No one knows exactly how. Some suggest infection, others a fall, others a sudden illness. There is no record of murder. only silence. And Egypt, once again, had no clear heir. His death left a vacuum. I, the advisor, stepped in briefly as pharaoh. Then Horemheb, the general, took power and declared himself the rightful successor. They, too, would erase what came before. Not only Akhenaten, but Tutankhamun as well. His name was removed from king lists. His statues neglected, his tomb left untouched not out of reverence, but insignificance. It wasn't until over 3,000 years later, in 1922, that the boy would be remembered again. Howard Carter opened the sealed tomb and found treasures beyond imagination. A golden mask, chariots, jewelry, games, shoes, and a name. Tutankhamun, once forgotten. Now, the most famous pharaoh of all. Ironically, it was the obscurity of his rule that preserved his tomb, because he was deemed unimportant. His burial was modest, his name left off monuments, and so grave robbers overlooked him. What Akhenaten's enemies tried to erase, time accidentally protected, and when Tutankhamun rose again, it was not as a ruler, but as a symbol not of power, but of fragile permanence. A boy who reigned briefly, was buried quietly, and now lives in museums around the world, more seen than he ever was in life. Asterisk, the scroll is unrolled on a polished table, written in 2 languages, Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. It is not a demand, not a threat, not a boast of victory. It is a treaty, the oldest known surviving peace treaty in human history, and at its center is Ramesses II, the King of Kings, Pharaoh of Egypt, son of Ra, builder of temples so vast they still stand in silence today. But this story is not about his wars. It is about what happened after. By the time Ramesses signed the treaty with the Hittites, he had already lived a full life in stone. He had ruled Egypt for decades, fought at Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in recorded history, carved his image into cliffs in Colossae from Nubia to the Delta. He called himself a god. He fathered over 100 children, and yet, like all kings who live long enough, he began to seek something quieter. Peace. The Battle of Kadesh had been fierce, but inconclusive. Neither Egypt nor the Hittite Empire could claim true victory. The cost was too high. The land between them, Canaan, Syria, was too difficult to hold, so both sides turned to the scroll. The Treaty of Kadesh promised mutual aid, non-aggression, extradition of fugitives, and royal cooperation. It even included a clause that Egypt and the Hittites would defend each other against internal revolts. It was signed around 1259 BCE, carved onto the walls of Karnak and the Ramesseum, copied onto clay tablets by Hittite scribes, preserved in the archives of both empires. This was not just a diplomatic formality, it was a moment of profound stability, and for a time it worked to seal the agreement. A Hittite princess was sent to Egypt to marry Ramesses. Her name has been lost, or perhaps hidden beneath layers of translated names, but in Egyptian records, she is called May Thornafor. She arrived with an escort, dowry, and translators. Ramesses married her, not in secret or shame, but with full ceremony. She became a queen among many, but one with political weight. It was a moment that symbolized a new order. Empires ruled not by swords, but by scrolls, by alliances, by memory. And for the rest of Ramesses' long reign, this order held. There were no major wars. Trade flowed. Temples were built. A peace, that rarest of royal legacies, became real. But like all peace, it depended not just on treaties, but on people. And when Ramesses died after 66 years on the throne, the scrolls could not rule in his place. His successors were many, but not mighty. His son, Merneptah, inherited an empire that still looked strong, but had begun to crack underneath. Foreign tribes from Libya pushed west. The mysterious sea peoples began to stir. The grain shipments slowed. The priesthoods grew impatient. The outer territories, especially Canaan, became unstable. The Hittite letters, once exchanged with courtesy and gold seals, stopped. No more brides, no more promises, no more shared protection. Egypt still stood, but it no longer looked outward. It began to retreat into itself, and in Hatshepsut, the Hittite capital, things grew worse. Internal revolts, famine, a civil war that would burn the city to the ground within a generation. The peace treaty had been brilliant, visionary, precise, but it was not inheritable. Ramesses could make peace. He could even enforce it. But he could not teach those who came after him to believe in it. And so, a question began to form in the minds of priests, generals, and scribes. Was peace even Egyptian? Oh, was it just a pause in the grand rhythm of conquest and gods? Asterisk, the letters stopped arriving. For decades, messages had flowed between Egypt and the Hittite Empire like slow-moving riverboats, carefully worded, respectfully phrased, pressed into clay, or painted on papyrus. Kings addressed each other as brother, not enemies, not rivals, equals. But now the roads are quiet. Ramesses II is dead. The scrolls remain, but the hands that signed them are gone. And so begins the quiet collapse of the world that diplomacy built. His son, Merneptah, inherits not a kingdom of strength, but a burden of expectation. He is already old by the time he takes the throne. His armies are still trained. His scribes still copy hymns, but the borders are restless. In the west, Libyan tribes push forward, bringing with them a coalition of foreign migrants, an early wave of what Egypt will come to. No, as the sea peoples in the northeast, vassal states are growing impatient. Some stop paying tribute. Some begin siding with new powers emerging coastal kingdoms and shifting Levantan alliances. Egypt responds with strength, but not innovation. Merneptah fights back the Libyans. K claims victory. He carves the story into the Merneptah Stelath, first inscription in history to mention a people called Israel. But the victory is defensive, not expansive. He is not expanding Egypt's world. He is shrinking its perimeter. And in Hatshepsut, the Hittite capital, things are worse. The Hittite Empire begins to disintegrate. Famine strikes. Crops fail. Trade routes break apart. Internal rebellions flare up in the outer provinces. Letters recovered from the ruins of Hatshepsut reveal a desperate court. In one, the king pleads, "There is no grain. My people die. Send help." But Egypt cannot send help. Its own supplies are strained. Its administration weakened. Its borders frayed. The great empires, once linked by treaties, brides, and gold, are now isolated islands of memory. No one is answering. And then the fire comes. Somewhere between 1200 and 1177 BCE, a cascade of destruction begins. It is not a single war, not a single people, but a collapse. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean began to fall. Ugarit burned, Hatshepsut abandoned, Alatia sacked. These are not minor settlements. They are cultural centers, ports of trade, homes to scholars and scribes. Gone to sea peoples, a confederation of displaced groups strike with speed and precision. Their origin is unknown, perhaps from the Aegean, perhaps from western Anatolia, perhaps both. They do not settle. They destroy, and Egypt, once again, finds itself alone. It is during the reign of Ramesses III, a later pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, that the final waves come. The sea peoples reach Egypt's borders. They land on its shores. They bring chariots, swords, families, not just soldiers, but migrants, desperate and determined. Ramesses III fights them back. His victory is carved in detail at Medinet Habu, vast wall of spears and ships, of chaos held at bay by divine order. But it is a last stand, not a restoration. Egypt survives, but barely. its economy crashes, its population declines, its temples begin to close. There are no more letters, no more treaties, no more royal brides from distant lands. The world Ramesses II once ruled a world built on diplomacy has ended. What failed? Not the words, not the scrolls. What failed was continuity. The peace between Egypt and the Hittites was real but fragile. It lived in the hands of two kings, in the memory of a generation. And once they were gone, the scrolls became meaningless. Treaties cannot defend borders. Marriages cannot stop famines. Paper cannot hold an empire. And so, quietly, the bonds broke. And Egypt, like its former allies, began to forget the shape of peace, but scattered in archives and carved into limestone walls. The words still remain, a letter from one king to another. Let us not bring war again. Let us speak as brothers. Let the gods see us as one, a dream, now dust. And we ask, can peace built on gold and ink survive a world made of hunger and fire? Asterisk, a broken city lies silent in the highlands of Anatolia. Hatshepsut, the once proud capital of the Hittite Empire, is buried in ashen weeds. Its gates have been splintered. Its archives lie shattered across stone floors. The libraries, once filled with thousands of cuneiform tablets, now house only wind. No trumpet announced its fall. No pharaoh came to mourn it. And somewhere in the desert light, far from the crumbling walls, Egypt continues, but changed by the end of the 12th century BCE. The world Ramesses II knew was gone. The Bronze Age collapse, slow, suffocating unraveling of cities, trade, language. In memory had begun to erase the interconnected map of powers that had defined the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt remained standing, but only just. The grain ran short. The wages of tomb workers went unpaid. Priests grew louder as kings grew weaker, but the pharaoh's titles, once proclaimed with thunder, are now whispered behind closed doors. The children of Ramesses and his golden peace no longer ruled an empire. They ruled over memory. What happened to the treaty? Fiscally, it survived. A version of it still sits on display in the United Nations building in New York, a copy of the Hittite clay tablet. The earliest peace agreement we know, but politically, it died with its authors. It had no heirs. Ramesside, Ramesses' son, had little interest in diplomatic tradition. His successors fought off invaders, not ideas. The priesthood reclaimed influence. The military governed more and more of daily life, and the paper piece became just that. Paper. There's something haunting about this, because Ramesses II didn't just sign a treaty. He believed in a world that could be bigger than conquest, where empires could coexist, where gold could buy not just chariots, but trust. The Hittite kings believed it too. They sent brides, not armies, scrolls, not spears, but they failed to institutionalize that peace. There was no education in diplomacy, no ministry of memory, no path for scribes to preserve alliance as sacred. And so, when the grain failed, when the seas churned, when the sea peoples landed, there was no one left to remember how peace had once been built. Even in victory, Ramesses had hinted at his fears. Though he carved his treaty in stone at Karnak, he also built colossi of himself, huge, intimidating statues, looking down at the people like eternal gods. Illicit pride or warning? See, building for the future against its forgetting, because after him came decline. Egypt's empire retracted. Its rulers shrank in ambition. Its enemies grew closer, and the scrolls, those fragile documents once passed with reverence across empires, were forgotten in dusty storerooms, left to rot beside receipts for cattle and jars of honey. The only reason we remember them now is because of what was buried. In 1906, German archaeologists uncovered the archives of Hatshepsut. Among the fragments, they found the tablets, and among those tablets, they found the words, "There shall be peace and brotherhood between us forever." forever. It didn't last, but it was tried. So we end with a scroll, not torn, not burned, left unread. And we ask, is the first peace more fragile than the first war? And who must remain alive, not just to sign it, but to remember why it mattered? Asterisk, you wake to the smell of burning grain. Not a feast, not an offering. It's just the bitter scent of hunger and fear. The granaries are sealed. The scribes are gone. And in the western sky, smoke curls upward slow and silent. This is not a war. This is something deeper. This is the end of something that once called itself eternal. It begins quietly, not with spears, but with climate. Somewhere near the end of the 13th century BCE, the climate of the eastern Mediterranean began to shift. The rains came late. The Nile's inundation weakened. Harvests failed not catastrophically, but consistently, and in a kingdom where every system depends on rhythm planting, taxing, feeding, praying giving, a small interruption becomes a crack. The scribes start recording shortfalls. Temples began delaying festivals. Towns began rationing barley and out beyond the desert's edge. Other kingdoms are suffering too. The sea peoples are not a single people. They are not a tribe, not an empire. They are a weaver confederation of displaced migrants. Raiders, exiles, warriors, and desperate farmers pushed by famine, pulled by survival. Their names are scattered in Egyptian texts: Sheridan, Skalesh, Lucca, Pelesed, Tjeker, each with their own boats, Akhes, but united by one thing: nothing to return to. They begin attacking ports in the Levant. They sack coastal cities, came then inland cities, then civilization itself. They are not invaders. They are the result of everything already collapsing. Egypt watches. The horizon, in the reign of Ramesses III, the last pharaoh with real power. The storm arrives. He is not blind. He has seen what happened to Ukrit, to Cyprus, to the Hittites. He knows they are coming, so he prepares. He builds a navy. He trains archers, constructs coastal defenses, and when the sea peoples reach the Nile Delta, Egypt is waiting. At the Battle of the Delta, the invaders are defeated. Ramesses III triumphs. He has the reliefs carved into the walls of Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple. They show chaotic scenes, ships tangled in battle, warriors dragged from boats, women and children among the enemy ranks. It is a victory. Genuine one, but the cost is unseen, because Egypt survives the attack, but not the after. Trade collapses. Foreign territories are lost. The empire retracts. Temple income shrinks. Priests complain. Soldiers go unpaid. And in Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who build royal tombs, something unprecedented happens. The workers go on strike. They leave their tools, sit outside the overseer's house, refuse to work until they are fed. They write letters. They demand their grain, and for the first time in centuries, the pharaoh does not respond with divine decree, but negotiation. The gods are still painted on the walls, but no one believes they're listening. Ramesses III dies likely murdered by his own wives and officials, part of a harem conspiracy to place a different heir on the throne. He is buried in KV11, in the Valley of the Kings. But the valley is no longer sacred. Tomb robbers are growing bolder. The gold has begun to disappear, and his sons. They inherit a kingdom that is no longer a kingdom, just a memory in a dusty archive. So we ask, as the sand begins to drift over fallen cities and unread scrolls, was it invasion that ended the pharaohs, or the slow, unrelenting loss of certainty? Asterisk, the throne is still there, made of gilded wood, carved with sacred scenes, flanked by lions, cushioned by offerings of obedience. But it feels lighter now, less like a symbol, more like a chair. After Ramesses III, The rulers who sit here will still call themselves gods. They will still wear the crown, still appear in temple festivals, receive tributes, sign decrees, but none of it moves the earth anymore. The 20th dynasty limps forward. Ramesses IV. Then 5. Then 5 names, carved in stone, but barely echoed in memory. Each one rules for fewer years. Each one inherits a little less than the last dot. In theory, they are divine. In practice, they are desperate. Ramesses IV begins with hope. He plans massive building campaigns, sends expeditions to mines, and dreams of restoring Egypt's greatness. But the workers are tired, the priests hesitant, the roads no longer safe. His tomb is carved deep in wide KV2. It's in the Valley of the King's Bud. It is half finished when he dies. Ramesses V reigns for only 4 years. T's mummy is found buried, with his successor Ramesses VI themed awkward, cramped double burial, likely done to save resources. Even the tombs of gods are now on shared lease. Asterisk. In the south, in Thebes, the priests of Ammon are watching. They remember a time when pharaohs built temples, gold flowed from Nubia, when offerings filled storage rooms. Now they see shrines neglected, granaries empty, royal guards underfed, and so they begin to govern, not by coup, not by revolution, just by filling the void. They collect taxes directly. They manage irrigation. They arbitrate land disputes. They reissue religious calendars and records from the Harris Papyrus. Ramesses III's endowment to Ammon is meticulously recorded. Thousands of acres, cattle, ships, workers. By the 21st dynasty, the high priest of Ammon controls more than the pharaoh does. The state has split not in blood, but in authority. The pharaoh still rules in name. Priesthood rules in reality. Meanwhile, tombs are being robbed, not by foreign raiders, but by Egyptians, in the same valley where kings sleep beneath mountains of prophecy. The very workers who carved those tombs now tunnel back in. They steal jewels, unwrap mummies, melt down gold amulets. The judicial records survive trial transcripts of thieves explaining how they crept past guards, where they found the burial shafts, how they divided the loot. One worker says plainly, "There was no more food. We had no grain. We knew the tombs had it." Even the dead are no longer sacred. And then, Ramesses Shi, the last pharaoh of the new kingdom, the final breath of divine kingship before it collapses into something else. He rules for almost 30 years. But Egypt is no longer whole. In the north, rival warlords gain control. In the south, the priesthood now crowns kings on its own terms. There is no great war, no foreign invasion, disconnection. 1. Egypt becomes 2, then 3, then none. And still, the scribes write, the temples chant. The Nile flows, because Egypt does not fall. It forgets. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the tombs are abandoned, the cities hollowed out. The names of Ramessides once, carved 1,000 times into stone, begin to fade beneath sand and wind. The sea peoples are gone. The storms have passed, but the damage remains, not in what was destroyed, but in what was no longer believed. Asterisk, the Nile still rises. The stars still turn above Thebes. The festivals of Ammon still flicker with incense and chant. But the pharaoh, he is a shadow now. His face still appears on stele. His name is still read aloud in temples, but the voice no longer commands. The 21st dynasty begins not with a conquest, but with a quiet arrangement. Smens, a powerful official in the delta city of Tanis, declares himself king. No bloodshed, no divine dream. Just paperwork, priests, and enough influence to make it official. He controls Lower Egypt, but in the south, Thebes belongs to someone else. The high priest of Ammon-Herihor, rules Upper Egypt. He wears the same titles, lies in royal palaces, issues decrees with the language of pharaohs. But he is not called king yet, at least not publicly. And so, for the first time in over 1,000 years, Egypt is ruled not by one man, but by two powers. The priests do not pretend anymore. They mint coins, hold court, command armies, manage temple estates that stretch for hundreds of miles, and the kings in the north. They rule in name over towns that once fed the world, now shrinking into provincial silence. This is not civil war. This is civil forgetting. No side has the strength to reunite Egypt. No side has the will. Instead, Egypt becomes ceremonial, a kingdom made of anniversaries, of rituals without teeth, of crowns placed on heads no one bows to, and yet life goes on in villages. Farmers still plant wheat. Children still learn hymns. Masons still carve the gods into tomb walls, but the great building projects have stopped. The pyramids are closed. Temples are smaller, quieter, recycled. Old statues are reused. Names overwritten. Intanis, Smens, constructs his monuments using stone pulled from the ruins of Ramesses, the once great capital of Ramesses II. Even the cities have begun to cannibalize themselves. One day, someone walks past a wall in Thebes. A name has been scratched out, another carved in its place. It is the name of Ramesses She, the last of his line. The end of the great family that ruled for nearly 200 years. He is no longer remembered for what he did, only for the fact that he came last. After him, the throne is passed to strangers, 2 Libyans, 2 Nubians, 2 Persians, to Greeks, each one calling themselves Pharaoh, each one borrowing the language of gods, but none of them born of the Nile's old blood. The tomb builders at Deir el-Medina abandoned their tools. They take up farming or leave for the delta. The tombs of the valley are stripped, looted, resealed. Even the body of Ramesses II, the Great One, the builder, the treaty maker, is unwrapped by priests and hidden in a secret cache to protect it from thieves. They leave him not in his golden tomb, but in a communal shaft with other kings, labeled, stacked, preserved, not as gods, but as artifacts. So Egypt ends not with an invasion, nor a revolution. It ends with a generation of people who could no longer afford to remember. A generation that found itself tending temples they didn't believe in, guarding tombs they couldn't feed from, and watching the horizon for invaders they could no longer name. The gods still had names. The pharaoh still had titles, but the land had already let go. And in that letting go, something beautiful and terrible happened. Egypt became a past, not a future. So we ask, as the sand smooths over what remains, can a civilization survive if it no longer remembers what made it sacred? Asterisk, you stand at the edge of a valley where kings once slept. The tombs lie beneath the rock, cut deep into the mountain-like veins, winding through limestone, sealed for eternity. Or so it was believed, but eternity, it turns out, is fragile, and, in the dark of night, eternity can be unlocked with a chisel. The story begins in the 20th dynasty, during the fading years of Egypt's new kingdom. The pharaohs are still divine in name, but not in reach. Their kingdoms have shrunk, their armies weakened. Their temples survive only through grain loans and old rituals, and in the Valley of the Kings, once the sacred resting place of Egypt's greatest rulers, the stone begins to break, not from earthquakes, but from human hands. Tomb robbery in Egypt was not new, but now it becomes commonplace. Why? Because the old system, the one that protected the dead, was breaking down. Tomb guards went unpaid. Workers at Deir el-Medina were starving. Priests, once wealthy and honored, now sold temple land just to buy bread. Gold shipments, 2 temples halted. Scribes falsified records. Whole tombs sat unsealed, unfinished, or only partially hidden, and the knowledge of those tombs still lit in the minds of the men who built them. Masons, painters, stonecutters, scribes, men who once honored pharaohs, now dug up their bones, not out of hatred, not out of greed, but because they had no other choice. We know their names because of the trials between the reigns of Ramesses I and Ramesses XI. Dozens of court records were written, preserved, and forgotten till discovered thousands of years later on faded papyri. They are known today as the tomb robber papyri. Among them, Debit papyrus, the Amherst papyrus, and the Meyer papyri. Inside, we find testimonies, confessions, inventories of stolen goods, and a slow, raveling truth. Egypt was robbing itself. A worker named Menpenufer confesses that he and a group of men broke into the tomb of King Sobekemsaf II. We found the king's burial chamber. We opened the sarcophagus. We found gold, amulets, and linen. We took them. We divided them. I got 1 gold ring, 2 amulets, and 5 Debenham silver. Another group of robbers broke into the tomb of a queen. They pulled her mummy from the coffin, stripped it of jewelry, burned the linen wrappings for easier access. They admitted it with almost no emotion, not because they were cruel, but because hunger dulls guilt. The court system tried to respond. Trials were held in Thebes. Accused men were interrogated, sometimes beaten, sometimes tortured. Some were sentenced to death. Others had their ears or noses cut off. Some were simply let go. In one trial, the very scribes recording the confessions were found to be involved in the crimes. The corruption ran deep, too deep to stop, and then the priests took over, not just in government, but in looting. With the collapse of royal power, the priesthood of Amun became the de facto rulers of Upper Egypt. They claimed to protect the dead, but records show that they began to re-enter tombs, remove valuables, and rebury the royal mummies. Their stated reason: to protect them from theft. But in doing so, they stripped the kings of their ornaments, removed gold funerary masks, took rings, amulets, necklaces. In one case, a priest wrote, "We found the burial unguarded. We removed the items. We wrapped the body anew. We placed it in a secret cache for safekeeping. May the gods understand." The DB 320 cache, discovered in 1880, one held over 50 royal mummies, including those of Thutmose III, Seti, and Ramesses II, all removed from their original tombs, all stripped of burial wealth. They had not been forgotten. They had been managed down in some ways, betrayed by their own priests, and yet the people still believed. Even as the tombs were looted, villages left offerings near cave shrines. Even as mummies were unwrapped, the Book of the Dead was still copied. Even as priests looted kings, the gods were still spoken of in reverent tones. The system had broken, but the ritual never stopped. So we ask, under the heat of a sun that has risen over 1,000 stolen tombs, what happens when those meant to protect the past become its quietest thieves?